Well, thanks a lot for inviting us all here. It's such a great pleasure to be here with David and Jason and to be here with all of you. I've learned a lot by going to this conference. I, and like Jason and David, am a social psychologist in my training. That means that when I go to a conference like this one, and I hear a lot of discussion about inequality and resources and opportunity and access, so important, I'm always wondering, what about the thoughts and the feelings of the people that are affected by these structural factors? What about the perspective of the individual who is contending with inequality? What is that psychological perspective like? And I think the big point, pulling the camera back, the big point of these presentations, and I think psychology and behavioral science writ large, is that there is not only a economic and material dimension to inequality, but a psychological one. Inequality can exist in the minds and the hearts of the people in the here and now that we're trying to help. And I've wondered a lot why this perspective of the experience of an individual, of a student from a poor setting or a student from a minority background, is so absent from so much of the social science. And I think it may be because it feels sort of soft and touchy-feely and maybe epiphenomenal. But what we want to convey is that the subjective is real, and it has real consequences, sometimes devastating consequences. So that's what I want to sort of emphasize, is just this sort of psychological dimension to inequality. None of us is psychologizing the problem, because ultimately psychology conspires with social structure to generate inequality. The two dance together. Okay, so that's the big picture, this sort of psychological dimension to inequality. People's thoughts, feelings, perceptions matter. Perception matters. Is that a B in the middle? Or 13? Is the misbehavior that I see coming from a student an isolated event or a sign that they're a troublemaker? The stereotype provides a context to interpret the meaning of a social event that then shapes the reality and the impact of that event. That's the psychological perspective, as Jason was conveying, that the meaning of an event, it can be vastly different from two different perspectives. Okay, so the psychological perspective of inequality. Here's a little passage from the writer Tobias Wolff. He's writing about the experience of a Jewish student in an elite prep school, Protestant, in the 1960s. And this is against the backdrop of widespread anti-Semitism against Jews in country clubs, the workplaces. And so that social reality informs, affects his experience of the college of the campus. Wolff writes, because he's the kid, he's thinking about telling his friends that he's Jewish, but he decides not to. He says, I decided it would be better not to say I was Jewish, even though there was no obvious anti-Semitism there at my school. The Jewish boys, even the popular ones, they just seemed to have a subtly charged field around them. It was like an air of apartness. And this air of apartness did not emanate from them, but from the school. It was as if a guardian spirit had risen from the walkways and weathered stone and breathed that apartness upon them. I love this quote because it shows how, for two students, a Jew and a Protestant, going to the same campus, same walkways, same Gothic architecture, for one, it's a pretty neutral, even positive experience. For the other, the Gothic architecture, the weathered walkways send these messages that you're on the outside. You don't quite belong here. Now you can imagine other kinds of cues that can send that message that you're an outsider that are even more significant. Here is, it's fuzzy, but here's a statue at a southern big public school, southern elite public school, selective public school, across the street from the psychology department is a statue honoring a Confederate soldier. From one person's point of view, this might just be a statue, but from the point of view of a sort of knowledge of the historical reality of racism and slavery and its kind of legacy in America today, this statue is freighted with meaning. Just like those fields and weathered walkways for the Jewish student send that message, you don't belong, you can imagine how cues like this in the environment and others can send the message, you're on the outside. That's a psychological experience of not belonging that is very interior, but very real and very important. So a lot of the research that we've conducted, other people have conducted, labs have conducted, kind of all make this point that the subjective is impactful and has an impact on objective indicators. It's not just a symbolic, this is not just a symbolic thing, it has objective consequences. One great example of this that you all may be familiar with is research by Claude Steele, Josh Ahrens, and Steve Spencer on stereotype threat. To make a long story short, the standardized test, a common ritual in school, is different, experienced differently by minority students and white students. For the white student, it's just a test. I have to deal with all the other academic pressures I have to deal with. Sure, I might be stressed about it. If I fail, it could be bad news for getting into college, but it's a test, and I kind of trust it, more or less. For an African American student, that test is freighted with meaning. If I do poorly on that test, it could validate this stereotype that's out there about me and my group of racial intellectual inferiority. And there's like an extra subjective meaning that that test has. So although objectively equivalent, the same test for these two kids, it's subjectively divergent. And Claude shows that this can have big consequences for test performance. When an African American takes a test that's said to be diagnostic of intelligence, on average they do a lot worse than when they take the same test and it's said to have nothing at all to do with intelligence, and thus nothing at all to do with the stereotype. That actually highlights one other key lesson here, which is that the status quo, like the racial achievement gap, is very persistent. We know that. But it's also not necessarily permanent, as far as sort of term from Sapolsky. That which is persistent is not necessarily permanent. You can eliminate the residual achievement gap just by reframing the test. Yet, in the real world, when we look, these racial gaps are persistent. Given that, what can we do in the real world to intervene? I actually don't like the term intervention so much. What are experiences that we can embed in the institutional environment that introduces positive consequence, positive processes, psychological processes? One of the implications of what we're saying is that thoughts and feelings matter, but they're invisible. You can't see them. They're powerful, but invisible. Are there kind of things you can do in the academic environment that cultivate a more sort of positive experience of school and thus send students in a more positive direction? One answer to this is obvious, right? You just kind of remove some of the threatening cues, like the statue, right? Another is you put people from various groups in positions of influence and leadership. There's a lot of research showing that when I feel like other people here are like me, there's other Jews or other minorities, and this is a place where people like me are in positions of influence, that feeling of stereotype threat, of being on the outside, goes down. So those are kind of no-brainers, inclusive practices and policies. What I want to talk about are a few little interventions that we've tested. I'll sort of just give the bird's eye perspective. The way to look at these is you could look at these as little nudges, helpful nudges. There's a term by Richard Thaler, like a little psychological nudge, a little push to look at it this way rather than that way. What we're introducing into that concept of nudge is this idea of flow. give a person a little bit of encouragement, a little bit of validation. See it as a B, not a 3. Look at it this way. In the right time, in the right place, that can change a trajectory. It's conditional, though. Nudge and flow. I need to kind of give you that encouragement when the river of opportunity is running. The channel is open. Encourage me to seize the opportunities in my environment at the right time, in the right place. I enter a more positive trajectory. The current takes me down to a more positive destiny. That's the idea. A little nudge in the right place can go a long way. So here's a few examples. David talked about growth mindset. So what these are kind of just like quick little examples of helpful nudges that in the right time, in the right place can go a long way, much like David's discussion of growth mindset interventions. Skip. Okay, one, this is research in collaboration with lots of people. David Jaeger was the lead, Julio Garcia, Valperde Vons. Here we want to kickstart a process. So the way to look at this intervention is a kickstart. How can we build trust at a formative moment? And what we did was with middle school teachers, in an ordinary suburban school, we're working with kind of B and C students, so students in the mid-range. We did a little study where we looked at the everyday situation where a kid gets feedback on their paper. In middle school, like 7th grade. 7th grade is like this sort of turbulent time. Kids can take a negative turn, so we're working at this sort of sensitive period when a lot of children take a negative turn, and we're looking at this experience of when I get critical feedback in school, how do I interpret it? How do I experience it? Now, if I have an error of apartness, if I feel like I don't quite belong, I might see all this red ink as a sign that this person doesn't believe in me. Maybe they're stereotyping me. I don't know if I can take the feedback at its word. What can we do about that? In social psychology, what we're trying to do is change meaning. So can we create a context in which this feedback comes across as positive rather than negative? And what we did was to randomize kids to get a little note from their teacher. We called WISE feedback. This is a Goffman term. He borrowed it from the gay subculture. WISE just means conveying respect across lines of difference. In one condition, experimental, I'm sparing you a lot of details. There's a randomized, double-blind condition. We had the teachers pen the notes in advance, sparing you all the details under the hood. I'm giving you these comments the teacher wrote in their own handwriting because I have high standards and I know that you can reach them. And then the criticism follows. We actually stole this from observations of what great teachers do in the classroom. And one thing they do that's actually not very common is they make it really clear that I believe in you. I have high standards, and that's what explains the rigor of the classroom and the content of my criticism. It's a little like psychological jujitsu. I get this, and now instead of taking the criticism as a sort of damnation, I see it as this person believes in me. It's an affirmation. It sort of shifts the perspective. A 2 becomes a B. In a control condition, students I'm giving you these comments, so you have feedback on your essay. We did various things. Here, I'll just show you one bit of data. It's just from a little pilot study. I'm just going to show white students in the control condition. This is the percentage of students who kind of revise their essay. Do you dust off your boots and try again and revise your essay after getting the criticism? 62% of white students in the intervention, 87%, not that big a difference. But for the students who are kind of contending with this difference, who are wondering, do I belong here? The African American students, on average, in this context, where there's a sort of stereotype lingering, ambiguating the meaning of the treatment I'm getting, this intervention has a whopping effect. Only 17% revise in the control condition, but 71% do when they get this little note. One of the lessons here is that we think of interventions as sort of these objective things, but they have a subjective reality. That which is small can actually be big from a psychological perspective. The message that you believe in me can speak volumes to a kid who's wondering whether they're going to be marginalized. So that which is small might not necessarily be small. Another point here is that the intervention has no intrinsic causal power, right? It's just a little note. It makes no sense to say this thing is necessary and sufficient to cause improvement. It acts as a catalyst for what's already there. It's a trigger. That trigger leads to a chain reaction. I now know I can take the feedback seriously, and so the kid's motivation can express its full impact. The criticism that I'm getting, the instruction, can express its full impact. A lot of these interventions, they're not causal entities unto themselves. They're catalysts. They trigger a process that's already there in the world that we can't quite see, but that's powerful. Okay, let me give you a few more examples. Skip. Shoring up belonging in college. This is with Greg Walton and Shannon Brady here, a doctoral student. Again, what we're doing here is trying to create a psychological reality where kids can seize better the opportunities before them, as David was conveying. Be more willing to put themselves out there and take a risk. So what we did here in lots of studies, David and Greg have scaled this up in big studies. I'm not going to talk about them. I'm just going to give one little example. All we did was this. Seems simple, but actually it's a lot under the hood. We took college freshmen at a selective college, and we brought them into the lab for an hour study. And I tell you, as part of the study, hey, we're trying to figure out what it's like to be a student here, and we want to get your opinion. Not only that, we want to get your help. We want to understand the experience of students here at college so that we can help incoming freshmen, so that you can help incoming freshmen. So the message here is that you will be a benefactor, not a beneficiary, which is true. We do use these, what the students generate in these studies. So what we do, so there's no sort of stigmatizing message that you need help. And then what we do is we give them a survey of upperclassmen at their school. And that survey reveals two things: that difficulty is normal and that it tends to be short-lived. For example, you read as a participant that one upperclassman at your school said, after winter break, I realized that all my good friends were at home. I didn't have friends like that at school, but I got involved then in extracurriculars. I met people who had common interests, but this took time. And before I found my niche here, there were times when I felt very lonely. And that's from a senior white female. Another student writes, I worried that I was different from other students. Now it seems ironic. Everybody feels they are different freshman year from everybody else, when really, in at least some ways, we are all pretty similar. The message here is that if you're experiencing the feeling that this is not your home, that you feel that air of apartness, that's to some extent commonplace. It's a natural process. You're normal. It's not something special about you or members of your group. And also, with time, it's likely to get better. So these are powerful messages. You're normal, it will get better, but they're conveyed with credibility through statistics, surveys. So credibility is a key issue. Anyway, what happens? I have a slide, but I'm not going to present it. Here's what happens. Over the course of 4 years after this one-shot intervention, a sort of new lens for seeing my social experience, we find that African American students are more resilient to negativity in their environment. So if they have a bad day, they're less likely to feel like they don't belong if they get the intervention. Not only that, they're more likely to put themselves out there and email a professor if they have a question. Not only that, 4 years later, they're more likely to they have higher GPAs in the treatment condition than in the control condition. In fact, the intervention improves the GPA of African American college students over the course of 4 years to such a level that it halves the achievement gap in GPA. Again, the intervention has no intrinsic causal power. It's a catalyst, because what Shannon finds is that when you look at what's going on, one of the things that's going on is that these kids who get the intervention, they put themselves out there and they make a relationship with a mentor and with a college professor. And a lot of the relationships they have are powerful and poignant. Many of the students write about, for instance, I remember one student wrote about how she was studying in Greece and her professor, a really old guy, emeritus, went all the way out there to visit her just to see how she was doing and help her out. And that kind of mentoring relationship was very influential to her, but it may never have occurred had not that initial trigger of this intervention been there. Okay, so shoring up belonging, kickstarting the process of belonging, kickstarting the process of trust through wise feedback. One last one that you can see I was overly ambitious in these slides. I still have 5 minutes? Okay. I already said all this. This is not useful. Not useful yet. Oh, yeah. One other. Actually, before I get into affirmation, I should kind of do a call out to Nicole Stevenson, who shows, interestingly, that you can also shore up belonging by pointing out how you're different. So our angle has been to say, hey, you're normal if you're experiencing difficult. Nicole Stevenson does this great work showing that, you can tell students like first-generation college students, hey, your first-generation status here is going to be an issue. So that means, whereas the other kids can call their parents to get help on which classes to choose and which majors to sign, you're going to have to find a mentor and get that advice from there. Not only that, though, what seems like a liability is actually an asset. So as a first generation student, you show a lot of grit. These other kids, they'll probably fold under pressure. You're special. It's not that extreme. That's caricature. Anyway, so she finds that boosts the GPA of first-generation college students. They do better academically, feel a greater sense of belonging, take more advantage of academic resources. So you can kind of get there to that sense of belonging through multiple routes, multiple experiences. Okay, affirmation, go through this real quick. Affirmation, it can be helpful to have an experience where I feel okay. And if I feel okay, then a biased teacher, a bad grade, I might be a little more likely to think of that as an isolated event rather than a sort of global evidence that I don't belong here. So that's the logic of self-affirmation. Bring to light a kind of larger, more expansive self-concept, thereby making a specific threatening event less disruptive. So that's what we did here. Long story short, with 7th graders, again, middle schoolers, we've also, Shannon Brady has done this with college students as well. But here's just kind of one of the early studies with middle schoolers. You pick some values that are important to you through a series of structured writing assignments, and then you write about why those values are important to you. That's the intervention. The teacher gives this to you early on in the school year, the transition to 7th grade, sort of key sort of fork in the road for a lot of kids. And so we're kind of nudging them in a positive direction towards that positive fork rather than that negative fork. And here's some examples of what our 7th graders write. My friends and family are most important to me. When I have a difficult situation, my friends give me companionship and courage. My family gives me love and understanding. So even though it's a small exercise, objectively small, it's subjectively, psychologically big. To me, independence is important because your parents won't always be there to baby you. You have to live your life. Athletic ability is also very useful. In 9/11, those people had to run down the stairways with some skill. If I didn't have my religion, I wouldn't know what to do. I would be lost. And so I'm bringing to mind, the kids are bringing to mind a more expansive self-view. So maybe that helps me cope with the situation of, yeah, I'm seeing in my environment evidence of bias against me. I'm seeing, like I maybe got a bad grade in the first few weeks of middle school. And I feel, okay, this is like that's, in the grand scheme of things, that is not so psychologically bad. And there's actually basic research showing that calling to mind these important values lowers the stress hormone cortisol in evaluative settings. Anyway, so we do that. Key periods throughout the year. I'm going to make a long story short. I'm not even going to show you the slide. What we find is that the intervention improves the GPA of 7th grade students throughout their 2 years of middle school, but only for that group that feels the air of apartness. That can be African American students in one school, Latino Americans in another school, in research with David Sherman, another replication. It has no effect on white students, but it does significantly improve the GPA of African American students, closing the achievement gap between them and their white peers by roughly 30%. It's not eliminating the gap, but it's closing it substantially. This nudge and flow idea, though, says that, well, if that happens, it could trigger a chain of events in the right time, in the right place, if I exist in an environment with channels of opportunity. This is a sort of typical middle school. In 6th grade, everyone's pretty much in the same courses. 7th grade, all of a sudden there's remedial courses and advanced courses. 8th grade, then you have this opportunity for enrollment in an honors program and a college prep program. There's this sort of branching river of opportunity, like implicit tracking. So you can imagine if you nudge a person, like right here in the 7th grade, onto a more positive course. Maybe they just make the cutoff for missing the remedial course. Missing cutoffs can have a big effect. Then I might be on a more positive trajectory downstream. Maybe my middle school career goes better. Maybe my high school career goes better. Maybe as a result of missing that remedial track, I'm more likely to be in the mainstream courses in high school. So what we did, this was with the awesome help of Eric Bettinger and Dimitri Karaganis. What? Calagrinis, thanks. We looked just at college enrollment. And through the National Clearinghouse data, we had the names of these kids, and we submitted them and just saw who was enrolled in college. White students, there was no effect. African American students in the control condition, 47% were going to a 4-year college. But African American students in the affirmation condition were going to college at a rate of 67%. Then we looked at the colleges. So given the importance of selective colleges that we know about, we all kind of know that selective colleges are very important for opportunity, especially as an engine of social mobility, perhaps. If we look at the percentage of college goers going to highly competitive schools, is getting a Barron's rating of highly competitive or above. For white students combined, just combining for ease and speed of presentation, no difference. 32%. Black students control 11%. Black students who had been affirmed years earlier, 29%. Okay, I don't have time to go into the replications. There have been a number of replications. I don't want to say that for any of these things, they work all the time. The argument with nudge and flow is that in the right time, in the right place, under the right circumstances, then this can catalyze processes and opportunities that are already there. Okay, I want to end on a couple big picture points. This will be brief. Big picture, just two. One is the results have show the power of a sort of shot in the arm approach to intervention. Giving a kid a positive experience at the right time, the right place can change a destiny. But I don't think that that is the message. I think the message is more about culture and shifting a paradigm. It's not about give the kid a note or give the kid a writing exercise. It's about providing an opportunity for a kid to feel like they belong, to have that psychological equal playing field. Build that into the culture. It's much like Jason's research where he's showing that you change the lens, the paradigm that teachers are using to view their students so they don't commit that fundamental attribution error and think, hey, this is just a misbehaving kid. They think, oh, maybe this kid has other problems. Maybe there's more to it than meets the eye, something invisible. Change the paradigm, you can change the kid at a wide scale. I think what these results are really about is the importance of climate and culture and providing opportunities in the climate and culture, word and deed for kids to feel valued and like they can do it. Okay. Second point. So it's about culture, not a single intervention. Second key point. This is the last one. There is a dark side to these results. Actually, to all the results that we presented here at this session. So you go back to black students in the control condition, the percentage going to competitive school at this sample, in this time, in this place, is 11%. In the affirmation, it goes up to 29%. Okay, good news. The intervention has this big effect. What does this say about the status quo? By definition, this suggests that the status quo is failing to provide kids with the affirmation, the validation that they could get, that they should get to reach their full potential. Why is that? What's going on in the status quo? Joe Powers, a doctoral student here, and I have been talking about this. You can kind of invert the lens on these studies and ask, what do they say about what's going on in the status quo? It's kind of mysterious, right? That in David's research, 43% of kids have a fixed mindset. And giving them this little psychological nudge to think, hey, intelligence is malleable has this whopping effect. Why aren't they getting this message already in the status quo from their teachers, from their school, from their culture? Then, from that perspective, I think our eyes turn towards the many kinds of powerful, implicit, and explicit forms of racism, discrimination that cut kids off, not only from objective opportunities, but from a psychologically equal playing field. Thanks.